Great. Well, I think we've given everybody enough time to get started and join us. So I want to welcome everybody to our Express webinar, Achieving Organizational Agility with Scrum at Scale, where experienced Scrum at Scale coaches and trainers share insights into how to apply the Scrum at Scale framework. My name is Carol McEwen. I'm CEO and Chief Product Owner at Scrum at Scale, and I'm happy to be your host and moderator for today's session. In today's webinar, Steve Martin will be talking about enhancing cross-team coordination with Scrum at Scale. But before we get started, I'd like to briefly cover a few housekeeping items. So first, to provide the best listening experience, all audio lines except the host and presenter will be muted during the webinar. Please be sure to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A panel on your console. We'll do our best to answer your questions at the end of the session, but keep your questions coming. You may use the chat feature to share comments with other webinar attendees, but please be sure to direct all your questions for the presenter through the Q&A panel. And we will not be using the raise hand functionality today. So many people always ask, are there SEUs for these? So yes, you are eligible for a half an SEU per webinar. So you'll need to view 2 Express webinars to claim SEUs through the Scrum Alliance. And finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be available to play on demand from both the Scrum at Scale website and the YouTube channel. So we're ready to start today's presentation, and I'd like to introduce Steve Martin. Steve is a Principal Enterprise Agility Consultant with Agile Velocity and a certified Scrum at Scale trainer who works with management and executive teams as they adopt and expand Agile approaches across their organization. And Steve has over 25 years experience from Fortune 500 to startups across multiple industries, including finance, healthcare, IT, medical devices, biotechnology, communications, publishing, and more. Steve is also pursuing his doctorate in leadership during organizational change. So I can't think of anyone better than Steve to talk about cross-team coordination, and we're very lucky to have him here today. So Steve, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol. I'm so excited to be here. I want to say thank you for Scrum at Scale for inviting me to talk about some cross-team coordination. And before I get into some of those tips and tricks, just want to give a little bit of a brief recap of the 2 main cycles of the overall Scrum at Scale framework. You know, as you might recall from either Dr. Sutherland's overview webinar or the Scrum at Scale guide, which, by the way, just got its latest revision on the 29th of April. So this is stuff hot off the presses. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those yet, I wanted to just kind of say, hey, Scrum at Scale is there to help us really address when you've got networks of Scrum teams that need to work together to really solve those complex adaptive problems in a world today that's not only filled with like a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, but is also changing rapidly at the same time. Now, there's 2 cycles that make up the Scrum at Scale framework, and each of these cycles has a series of components or patterns that can help you customize your organization's transformation strategy. Now, one of the set of the components is the Scrum Master Cycle. And each of those components addresses the how of operating in a scaled environment. And the other cycle is the product owner cycle, and that really addresses the what, or the value delivery portion of a scaled environment. Now, regardless of whether you're working in either the Scrum Master cycle or the product owner cycle, you need to have teams, especially when you're working at scale. They need to coordinate, collaborate, communicate, because we're looking for really a highly effective overall organization when it comes to scaling. So it's easy to start requesting like a bunch of meetings, you know, to do this. But I can tell you, it's very rare that I hear, yay, let's have another meeting. Or even better, you know, the other phrase that I don't think is quite right is, that saying is, I'd rather over communicate. Well, Likewise, how many times do you get to hear, yay, I got more email today? I know, right? You just don't hear that. And so what we want to do is we want to find really that right balance, that right mix that enables us to share an appropriate amount of actionable information at the right time, which can help your organization operate with the greatest agility possible. So we do need to have some process, but what we don't want to do is to implement an overly burdensome bureaucracy for your organization. For that, what we need is what we call a minimum viable bureaucracy. Because here's the interesting thing. In today's economy, what really drives value is knowledge, specifically the sharing of knowledge. And so what we want to do is we want to emphasize quick dissemination and understanding of the relevant information. This is just so key to your organization and its success. And I know you're just saying, hey, Steve, just share some statistics with me. That's really top of your mind. So let me share some with you. So from our friends at the Standish Group, what they found is organizations that tend to make quick decisions, or those that have low decision latency, tend to have more successful project outcomes. And those with high decision latency, or those that take longer to make those decisions, tend to have less successful projects and much more challenged and much more failed projects. So we want to ensure that wherever you put in place in your organization, we want to enable the information to flow quickly to where it needs to go so that the proper decisions can be made in a timely fashion. And this is just really the key cornerstone for cross-team coordination. All right, with all that, let's see how we can apply this to Scrum. And before I kind of get into Scrum at Scale, I just want to do a quick little Scrum team recap, because it's going to be building off of this concept here. Because we know that Scrum teams from our education and things like that, what they're going to do is it's a team of 3 to 9 members that delivers products iteratively and incrementally, you know, getting feedback. They're self-organizing, cross-functional, and there's already 5 ceremonies that are built in that have an opportunity for collaboration, whether it's the sprint itself, sprint planning, daily scrum, sprint review, and sprint retro. That's all fine and well when you've got one Scrum team. But what happens when you've got a larger initiatives that requires multiple Scrum teams? And this is not unusual. It usually takes more than one Scrum team to get something really out the door. And this is where the concept of Scrum of Scrums comes into play. Now let's say that you've got 5 Scrum teams, and what we see up here on the screen is, you know, representation of 5 Scrum teams. What we can do is create a team of teams called Scrum of Scrums to help with that coordination and collaboration. In particular, what we want to do is make sure that this team of teams, this set of folks, has a potentially shippable increment from all the participating teams at the end of each sprint. So who's on this Scrum of Scrums team? Well, it consists of at least 1 member from each of the participating Scrum teams. And for me personally, I like to have a pair of folks from each Scrum team attend. It's not necessarily always a Scrum Master. Let's just say that somebody in quality might be having an issue. I'll have the Scrum Master and the quality person go together from that team to the Scrum of Scrums so they can talk about maybe an impediment or something that they're working through. So that's one thing. But here's really one of the key things when it comes to a effective Scrum of Scrums. The teams have to have a reason to coordinate and collaborate. You can't just throw it together for the heck of it, because then it tends to not really work all that well. It's just added bureaucracy. Let me give you an example. At one company early in my career, I was coaching a set of 7 teams total. Now I had 2 teams that were working together on one product, and then I had 5 teams working together on another product. And in my infinite wisdom, learning about Scrum of Scrums, I decided to create a Scrum of Scrums with all 7 teams together. So what was happening is that when the folks that were in the 2 teams were talking, the folks over here with those other 5, they could care less. They were doing their own thing. And when the team of 5 and those folks were starting to talk, that other part that had the 2 teams over here, they could care less. And so what it ended up being was just really a waste of time. So instead of having a scrum of scrums with 7 teams total, I actually broke it into 2 smaller ones. So the key takeaway from this story is make sure there is a reason for these folks to get together, all right? So when does this scrum of scrums meet? Well, when we start talking about a scrum of scrums, it's not an event. They actually meet in something called a scaled daily scrum. Now that scaled daily scrum is that event, is that meeting, 15 minutes that happens typically right after the daily scrum. So I'll show the schedule when I get to the next slide here. But it pretty much mirrors the daily scrum, and there's, typically a few questions that should be answered in a 15-minute time box. But the questions in a scaled daily scrum really center around things such as impediments, or even more valuable, taking a look at dependencies before they become impediments. Another thing that you can do in a scale daily scrum is share some improvements or practices that one team learned that the rest of the teams in that scrums might want to know about. So this scale daily scrum becomes really an important mechanism by which teams can collaborate and coordinate as the sprint progresses. But let's say, I've got more than 5 teams on my project. Let's just say I've got 10 teams total. Well, we've got something called a scrum of scrums, right? So it kind of rolls off your tongue, right? Scrum of scrums, which is really a team of teams. And this is what makes this really exciting, what makes Scrum at Scale infinitely scalable. What you want to do is you want to organize such that there's a reason for these folks to actually talk. Now, if I were to do a scrum of scrums with 10 teams, 1 person per team or 2 persons per team, and I try to do a scrum of scrums with that many teams, that's more than 20 people. I can't organize around that. That's really hard to really collaborate when you get to something that big. And so what we want to do here is break that big group into smaller ones, and then where they have cross things that they want to share and collaborate on, then you have this scrum of scrums that goes on top of this. So let me give a little example of this. So if you've got a group that had 10 teams and there was a logical reason to split them into 2 different groups. So in one organization that I did this with, it was at a biotech company where we were working on a quality information system. We had people that were under certain regulations, and then we had other people that were under other regulations, and the 2 regulations were separate. So what we did is we had 2 teams of 5, and we had 2 scrum of scrums. And for those things that were important that we needed to share across the across those 2 groups, we did the scrum of scrums. And the way that we held our meetings is each of the individual teams had their daily scrum at 9 o'clock. Held to the 15-minute time box, but I had to get my little booty across the other side of campus. I can't do that in a minute. And so I gave myself 15 minutes of walking time to get to the next meeting. And so then at 9:30, we had the scrum of scrums with either the blue team or the orange team. And then I gave myself another 15 minutes, and we got together with just representatives from the 2 scrum of scrums. So that's kind of how these things, basically relate to each other. And so this is really an exciting way. It doesn't have to be 5 teams. You can do 2 teams, 3 teams, 5 teams, whatever makes sense for your organization. Now let me share another case study with you. And this is actually coming from our friend Henrik Nyberg, who is in the process of becoming a Scrum at Scale certified trainer. And he was sharing with us the Spotify model and how we could use that as a potential case study for further cross-team coordination. Now, I talked about scrum of scrums and scrum of scrums. What we're going to talk about here is what happens if you've got, let's say, people within a specific skill set that want to learn from each other. And that's the concept of a chapter. So when you take a look at the screen here, you'll notice that all these folks here have a similar role. So let's just say for a software example, these might be all your UX folks. And these green folks here might be all your quality folks and things like that. If we had, for example, a marketing example, you could have, like these red folks here, perhaps be your social media folks, and these green folks in a marketing example might be your market research folks. So whether it's a software, non-software, you can use that concept here of organizing chapters in sharing things of people with a like skill set. But they also found at Spotify there was value in sharing information that wasn't necessarily specific to one role. They were just interested in a general topic. And that's where the concept of a guild came in. And so what you see here is there's multiple roles, multiple components and things like that, that people are just interested in this particular topic. So that's another way that you can share some information. So these case studies are going to be published pretty soon at the Scrum Scale website, and we can give you that link a little bit later on. So this is yet another way that you can do some cross-team collaboration. Now, everything that I've talked about so far tends to be more in that Scrum Master cycle portion of the Scrum Scale framework. What about the product? And so I'm going to shift over to the product owner side of the Scrum at Scale framework because it's just as important for there to be that collaboration for the folks who are identifying and prioritizing value for your company. So in Scrum Scale, the product owners, we've got something called the product owner teams, just like a Scrum of Scrums. And it's best if the folks on your PO team are working on something that is related, where there is a need for there to be a shared backlog, a single backlog that could be then fed into a network of Scrum teams. Now, the intention here is when you've got this grouping of folks and this grouping of the backlog together, that you're aligning the priorities across multiple teams towards a single vision or towards a single path. And that's really how you're going to maximize value for your organization. Now, to help with that alignment, I'd also like to mention that there is a role called the Chief Product Owner. Now, this person is essentially the PO for the product owner team, and this person is really critical. I can't overstate the importance of having a really good chief product owner, because what they're going to do is they're going to ensure that they have a vision for the set of teams so that they can help drive the coordination and generation of that single prioritized backlog that, again, is going to be disseminated across multiple Scrum teams. I know there's a lot of words that are on this page, so I do much better with pictures. So let me do a picture here to kind of show product owner teams, chief product owner, and that kind of stuff here. So let me show you what I did at another organization. So another organization that I was working with, I was coaching, again, 7 teams, but in this case here, it was across 3 different products. I had product X, product Y, product Z. The great thing that we had with this organization is that each of those Scrum teams had a dedicated product owner. They didn't know much about their challenges in the marketplace, and so they really wanted to make sure that they had a single product owner for each of the teams. And what it turned out was that for product X, there were 2 teams that were working on something very similar, but it was enough of a distinction where we needed 2 different Scrum teams. Same thing with product Y, same thing with product Z. And so what we decided to do here is, because we didn't know a whole lot about those particular products, we wanted to have someone to set that vision and set it forward. So we had a chief product owner, and in this case, 3 chief product owners, 1 over X, 1 over Y, 1 over Z. Now, when you look at this here, it just kind of implies that that is a separate person. Now, the chief product owner is not necessarily the same, it's not necessarily a new role. In the case of number X right here, in case of team X right here, this person here, the product owner for the team X1, was also the chief product owner for both of them. The same thing happened over in product Z. The chief product owner for that PO team Z was also the product owner of just an individual Scrum team. So it's not necessarily another person you have to hire. So again, what we want to make sure is that chief product owner is really ensuring that you've got that combined single vision, single backlog, so that you've got a group of teams working towards maximizing value against that backlog. And so it kind of looks something like this. So 3 PO teams, single backlogs for each, a chief product owner for each product owner team. And so again, if you got questions on that, be glad to answer those. Make sure that you use your chat window to throw those questions down in there. All right, so how did I keep each of these folks in alignment between Chief Product Owner X, Y, and Z? Well, in this case here, we had a VP of Product. In that VP of Product, we're not going to get into like chief product owners and things like that in this particular webinar, but this particular person, the Director of Product, worked with each of the Chief Product Owners of X, Y, and Z to make sure that these folks were in alignment and going the same way. So 2 more slides, and then we're going to be taking some questions here. So when do all these backlog refinements and things like that happen? Well, we saw a Scale Daily Scrum for Scrum at Scrums. Well, it's going to be a similar concept for a product owner team, except the product owner team is going to have what they call a scaled backlog refinement. And so it's basically these folks getting together at least once per sprint to talk about their particular backlogs and go through the refinements. It's typically run by the chief product owner. They're going to talk about strategies, negotiate priorities, you know, and things like that. And the things that they're talking about are not like individual product backlog items, you know, whether that backlog item is something like a user story or something like that. They're actually talking a little bit higher. They're talking like epics and in what order should we be doing things and things of that nature. The guidance from the Scrum Scale guide is to hold this at least once per sprint. Here's how I did it. With most of the folks that I was working with, they had a 2-week cadence. And so many of my teams kicked off their sprints on Wednesday. So they had their sprint planning on Wednesday, day 1. And so what we did is we had the scaled backlog refinement exactly 1 week later, the same day of the week as the sprint planning meeting, except on day 6 of that 2-week sprint. And so what that did is sprint planning day 1 on a Wednesday, scaled backlog refinement day 6 on a Wednesday, and you can kind of see how we just said, all right, Wednesday is our refinement or planning days. It's just in the schedule. We just knew that that was what was happening Wednesdays. And so that's how we did it, and that seemed to work pretty good for most of my clients when we did that model. Because when you do it like on that day 6, it gives you a couple more days before you go into the next sprint planning, just to kind of make sure you've got all the stories or other product backlog items ready to go for the next sprint. So that's some tips and tricks that I have for the product owner and the product owner teams. All right, so with that, let me do a couple recaps here, and then we'll go into some questions. So again, today's business environment is going so fast, so much uncertainty and ambiguity, and things are changing so quickly. Disseminating information is so vital. We don't want to have too much. We want to have just the right size, the right amount of information going out there. And we've got different ways that we can collaborate, whether it's through the Scrum of Scrums and the Scale Daily Scrum, or it's through the product owner team and the product owner scale backlog refinement, or even the case study from Spotify. We've got a lot of different options that are out there for you to really increase and enhance the collaboration across teams. All right, a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm sure, Carol, we've got some questions that came through. Let's see what we can do to answer some of those questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Dave. We do have a lot of questions, so we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And we're going to start with, I'll combine the first 2, is who should participate in the Scale Daily Scrum, and who should lead the Scrum of Scrums?
Excellent question. And so when you take a look at the new Scrum at Scale guide, or you go through one of our training sessions, we spend a lot more time on this. We spend actually 2 days talking about how we do collaboration across networks of teams. So what you got here was really a 15-minute version. The Scrum of Scrums is typically facilitated by who we call a Scrum of Scrums master. Just like the CPO, it's not necessarily a new person. It's typically just one of the Scrum Masters from one of the teams who's going to assume the responsibility of a Scrum Master that's going to help facilitate during the Scale Daily Scrum. So who are the people that typically go to the Scrum of Scrums? Well, it's usually the Scrum Master, and I like to have a buddy, have a pair from a Scrum team go to the Scale Daily Scrum as part of the Scrum of Scrums team of teams. And I typically take a pair with me who's ever having the challenge, dependency, impediment, difficulty, or if it's something that somebody tried as an experiment within an individual team and they want the other teams to know about that, I want to share the good stuff too. And so it's a little bit fluid, but I want to make sure that they meet on that regular cadence.
Great, thank you. So next question is there a component of portfolio management necessary for product owner teams in dealing with their backlog across their teams?
Absolutely. And so in this particular presentation, I was really focusing in more on perhaps what would be a portfolio, or I'm sorry, more of a program level, or just, a couple things that are related. There's actually something called an executive meta scrum, which we're going to talk about in some other of these webinars, and it's also part of the Scrum at Scale guide, where it talks about how do we take a look at governance in maximizing the value of a company. And so it's just a little bit out of scope for today's, but take a look at the Scrum at Scale guide. The executive meta scrum is really those folks that are really responsible for taking a look at how do we maximize the value of a portfolio. So there's some guidance that we can take a look at there. I can't answer that in 2 minutes though.
Okay, so thank you. Regarding Steve's case study, do the separate teams X and Y have their separate backlog, or they have the same backlog that team X and Y filters for themselves, and the PO X leads as the chief product owner? How did you handle dependencies among those separate backlogs?
Yeah, so in this particular company, they used one common system, one common thing. And what we did is we had two filters within the common enterprise system. One was which product or product area you were working with, and that was the XYZ. And then we had another filter underneath that, which team was going to be pulling in stories from that product backlog. Now, in this case here, product X and product Y really didn't have a lot to do with each other. And so there was no reason to, quote, combine those two together because they didn't necessarily have dependencies on each other. It was just teams X1, X2 had dependencies and kind of some interrelations with each other. So we kind of kept theirs separate by using flags and filters within the tool itself. Hopefully that made sense.
Great, thank you. Well, we've actually come to the end of our time box, so we're not going to be able to answer any additional questions today. But I would like to thank Steve for joining us. And if you'd like to learn more about Scrum at Scale, one of the best ways is to take a certified Scrum at Scale practitioner class. As Steve has mentioned, get into a lot more detail. And classes are delivered around the globe by our certified Scrum at Scale trainers. And in fact, Steve has a few coming up even as early as next week. So if you'd like to check us out at scrumatscale.com, the classes will be listed there, and then also you can check out the library of case studies and listen to previous recordings of webinars and learn about upcoming events. And we'd love your feedback, so in the last 30 seconds, if you could just post in the chat window there, tell us from a scale of say 1 to 10, how much value did you find in this webinar? So we really appreciate that feedback, and thank you for joining us. And Steve, thank you so much.